The scientific revolution starts now.
The is the Science Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
So this is part 2 of a longer conversation with Dr. Michael Hudson, and today we are examining the solutions for the economic burdens that we are facing in the West, in America in particular, and what a new state that had remedied these issues would actually look like. Because one thing that is constantly coming up in my conversations with people, especially in intellectual spaces, is the problems and how we're all headed for this terrible collapse. And I'm like, okay, that's fine, but nobody's going to agree to this collapse if we don't have a solution set in place. That is, what does the future actually look like when we reconstitute our government and have something that works for the people, not against the people?
The back half of this conversation should be about solutions, but I think something that we didn't really talk about yet is modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you bin that as part of the solution, or do you bin that as part of the problem?
Well, for many years, I was at the center university that promoted modern monetary theory, the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And that was created with a contribution by Warren Mosler to bring the faculty there. So yes, I'm one of the original modern monetary theory faculty people. And the theory is that it's not really a theory, it's a description of how the banks banking really works. And I guess the leaders of outside of academia are Dick Cheney and Donald Trump. They said that deficits don't matter. We can simply do what banks do. Just like when you go into a bank, and you take out a loan, the bank doesn't have to have any money in it. It will write you a loan, and it will deposit money in your account, and so the bank asset goes up by your deposit, and your asset goes up by the deposit. The bank has a credit to you, the loan IOU that you sign at interest, and the debt, what it's had to borrow the money from the Federal Reserve or something. Banks create their own credit money. Governments can do the same thing. The government can print whatever it wants, and in fact, every time there's a war, like World War I, all the observers thought that World War I was going to end in 6 months because governments would run out of money. Well, they didn't run out of money. They printed the money, just like America printed greenbacks in the Civil War. And people don't have to borrow money at all. For instance, I was the advisor to Canada in the late 1970s, and there was a controversy over should Canadian provinces borrow money from Germany and Switzerland. And you had the banks saying, let us, for a commission, arrange for you to borrow at very low interest rates from Switzerland and German. You'll borrow the marks from them, and you'll only have to pay maybe 2% instead of the 6% or whatever you're paying today. So they convinced the gullible provinces to pay money. Well, I was working for the government hired me to write a monograph, Canada and the New Monetary Order, for the one of their research institutes, and I pointed out, well, when the province of Alberta or wherever, Saskatchewan, borrows money from Switzerland, what happens? The Swiss bank puts the money in the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada then prints the Canadian dollars and turns it over to Manitoba or wherever for spending locally, because the provinces are not going to spend Swiss francs or German marks. They're going to spend Canadian dollars. I said, well, no matter what happens, the Canadian government's going to print these dollars. What do you need lenders in Switzerland or Germany to lend you money for? Well, there was a meeting with the banks, and they said, well, you need us to be honest just brokers. We decide who can afford to borrow money or not. And I said, let the government decide that. We don't need you at all. You're telling them to borrow money, anything that'll make you money. You're just a bunch of goddamn crooks. And they said, well, they need our advice. The governments are not competent. Government is bad. Private enterprise is good. We're private people. And they even trotted some Jesuit priest in that said, that way goes to the gas chambers. You can't have a strong government. Hitler had a strong government, and look what he did. Why do you want to send Canadians to the gas chamber and not let this nice Bank of Nova Scotia arrange a loan in Swiss francs? That actually happened.
Demystify Sci is purely supported by donations from audience members like you. I know that this sounds like an NPR ad or some kind of public radio drive, but the fact is that it is very, very true. And so if you like what we do, if you want to help us grow, if you want to help us do live shows, eventually start to fund independent research projects that the Academy will not fund, come over to patreon.com/demystifysci. For just a couple dollars a month, you can help us keep the ship going. You can join us on our weekly patron chats where we decide what the next conversations are going to look like, how we should dive deeper into topics. You can start to meet people that are into the same kinds of questions as you, join our community, and become a larger and larger part of the scientific revolution. Another way that you can help is you can block off April 6th and 7th of 2024 because we are going to host our very first event in Austin, Texas. We're going to time it to the eclipse, and we don't have tickets on sale yet, but as soon as we do, we will let you know. And if you don't have money, if you can't travel, then just leave a comment. Spread the word about the Demystify Sci podcast, and you will have done your part in making the scientific revolution a reality. For now, back to Michael Hudson.
And the result was that the banks, I'm sure there was personal bribery there because we're talking about Canada. And so they borrowed Swiss francs and German marks at a time when the Canadian dollar was worth more than the American dollar. It was up to about $1.10. Well, within 3 years, the Canadian dollar had sunk to 80 cents for the US dollar, and much more against the German mark and the Swiss franc that went way up. And the provinces were broke. They were strapped by having taken the private advice of the smart bankers. Smart bankers are ones who are smart enough to con you into taking their advice, and you end up without your pants on, and they've got everything. That's what a smart banker did. And they were chortling. They were so happy. Ha ha, we really screwed them. And that's what happened if you're a Canadian. They had given me a what are the temporary citizenship rights there, and needless to say, I had no interest at all in going to such a backward country that puts its faith in the bankers. And the irony is that the Bank of Canada was in the forefront of banks that created its own money before there was the revolution led by the liberals, of course. It's always the liberals and the left that have been the pro-financial, pro-war party, not the right wing, amazingly as that would occur. Well, modern monetary theory would have said what I told the Canadians. And in fact, I think that was the first official government publication of a modern monetary theory, when I said the governments can create money just like banks do. They don't need to tax money to create the money. They don't need to borrow from the 1% to run a budget deficit. They can run a budget deficit whatever they want, including today. You can run a budget deficit by the Treasury is empowered to create a coin of any value that it wants. It can take a piece of platinum and say, we've just created $1 trillion platinum coin. Now we have a lot of money to spend. We can just convert that into electronic dollars or paper dollars, and we don't have any money at all. We don't have to raise taxes. And that's just what Dick Cheney said. We can fight the war. We can run a huge deficit. We can just print the money. And Donald Trump said, I can print whatever I want. I can cut taxes on the rich people because the government can print the money. And modern monetary theory, of course, doesn't, unlike Trump and unlike Cheney, the modern monetary theory was developed by people who actually wanted to use money creation to fund productive capital investment, to fund infrastructure investment, to help make healthcare less expensive, to help build more public transportation and not privatize it. So we were not the right-wing looters like Cheney and Trump, but wanted to do it for a good social purpose. But that's the essence of monetary theory in a nutshell.
So why does the government creating money to spend on these sorts of projects, such as bridges, infrastructure, healthcare, why does it not devalue the currency?
Why would it devalue the currency? How would that help? Devaluing a currency doesn't build a bridge.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that, so again, rudimentary economic understanding, so forgive me if this is a stupid question, but my understanding is that if you have a fixed pool of money that is tied to some kind of constraint, you have a roof on the price that a good or service can cost, because you have a limited pool of monetary resources in order to be able to pay for that. And if you start to create money from thin air where you're just printing it, then what you're doing is you're creating more money that goes into the system that can be distributed for these same goods and services, and so they can start to rise in price because there's no longer that cap that was there before because the pool of money was smaller.
No, just the opposite. If the government builds a bridge, instead of letting a private monopolist build a bridge or a toll road, then it doesn't have to charge a toll. It doesn't have to charge as much. It doesn't have to pay interest to itself. It doesn't have to pay management fees. It doesn't have to pay dividends. Government infrastructure spending, is much more efficient in terms of price than if you leave the infrastructure to a finance capital firm that's going to screw you in just as many ways as the telephone company screws you trying to figure out all these extra charges on your phone bill.
Is this tied to the idea of debt in some way?
Of what?
I mean, it has to tied to the idea of debt and debt forgiveness, right? So if the government
No connection at all.
Well, because I mean, if
debt, the government will create its own money. There's no debt. Just like you mentioned before about in Babylonia, the most debts were owed to the palace and temples. Only since the Crusades in the 12th and 13th century did governments turn into debtors. Before that, through all of human history, governments were creditors. As tax people owed them taxes, or they bought goods and services from them. Churches were creditors. So the governments were creditors, not debtors. Government can do whatever it wants. It doesn't have to borrow. It can simply, if a billionaire says, okay, I'm going to help a government build a bridge, I'm going to lend it $200 million to build a bridge. The government's going to spend this money it borrows out of the billionaire's bank account in offshore in the Cayman Islands and turn it over to the government to spend it in the economy. How is that less inflationary than if the government simply doesn't need money from the Cayman Islands, but said, we're going to create our own money right here in the Treasury. We're going to call it the Cayman Islands Room, and we'll just print the money. The spending money that is provided by a private bondholder or a government treasury is identical, except if the treasury creates its own money, it doesn't have to pay interest on it.
Doesn't it threaten deflation of the currency overall in that case?
No.
Yeah, like isn't this what the Weimar Republic did?
No, not at all. No comparison whatsoever. The Weimar Republic collapsed because for the same reason that every country except Zimbabwe with a hyperinflation collapsed. It owed foreign debt as a result of the reparations. My book Super Imperialism describes this, and my Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, my textbook on international finance theory, describes this. Germany was after World War I ended, America shocked Europe by saying, we want to now be paid for all the arms that we sold you before we entered the war. And the British said, well, wait a minute, European countries, if we're on the same side, at the end of the war, we've always forgiven the debts. And America said, of course, we're not going to charge you for what we spent during the war, but before the war, you bought a lot of arms. Now you have to pay us the money. And Germany said, okay. England said, we're going to just make Germany pay. And France said, well, we're going to make Germany pay also, not only for the money to pay you Americans, but because we don't like for all the damage it caused. So Germany had to just keep printing marks, not to spend at home. None of this money was spent at home. It was spent on basic foreign buying the dollars and the sterling and the francs for foreign countries. Governments can create their own money without inflation. They can't create foreign currency and foreign debt that they have. And then you had bankers both from America and Europe saying, wait a minute, we see that Germany can't pay its debts. Let's play the currency market and let's bet against the mark. And you had all the speculation adding to all of the marks being thrown onto world markets. So the Weimar inflation didn't come from governments spending money domestically. It was from trying to pay a foreign debt by desperately throwing its currency onto the market. And it finally solved the problem simply by borrowing the money from U.S. bondholders to pay the debt. So the German municipalities and cities would borrow from Wall Street. They'd borrow dollars. They turn the money over to the Reichsbank. The Reichsbank would use these dollars to pay the reparations and the Allies. And the Allies would take these dollars and they would pay the U.S. Treasury for the inter-allied debts, and that was a circular flow of the 1920s.
Wow. Sorry, that's the most clear I've ever heard that story presented. It's very fascinating.
It's all, again, super imperialism has a whole chapter on this, and my whole trade, development, and foreign debt explains. Though there was a huge argument in the debate among economists in the 1920s over this: is there any limit to how much money Germany can pay? And the people who hated Germany, the Frenchmen especially, said, well, Germany can pay anything. All it has to do is pay labor less. It can squeeze its labor. And John Maynard Keynes and an American, Harold Moulton, said, wait a minute, there's a limit to how much debt Germany can pay. And that limit is how much foreign currency can Germany export to raise the foreign exchange, to pay the foreign exchange to the Allies, to pay their foreign exchange to the dollars. And Keynes said, but the problem is that the American Congress by the 1920s said, well, wait a minute, Germany's devaluing its mark. That means that it's competing and it's earning the money to export at the cost of American industry. So America passed a law against making a floating tariff for countries with depreciating currencies to prevent Germany from making exports to America, to raise the dollars, to pay the Allies, to pay for the inter-allied debts. So that Keynes and Moulton were right, but the losing argument, the people who were wrong, Bertil Ohlin, a Swedish economist at Harvard, and the French finance minister, the hardliners were saying exactly the same argument, that any country can pay any foreign debt, that the International Monetary Fund is used to wreck and turn Latin America and African countries into the same desperate situation that occurred in Weimar and in Germany and led to the Nazi Party.
So has there ever been a place that has successfully implemented modern monetary theory? Or is this still...
Well, how about the United States? The North won the Civil War by printing its own currency. It didn't have to borrow. I mean, every country that's gone to war has used in modern times has used monetary theory so that it can afford to fight the war.
And is the idea fundamentally that what you're doing is you're printing money in order to produce goods and services that are then folded into the economy and they remain in circulation, and so they raise the wealth without devaluing the currency?
Yes. No devaluation.
This is going to take me some
devaluation occurs as a result of the balance of payments, not the domestic economy, the balance of payments.
So how do we encourage the adoption of this policy?
Well, that's what the bankers have been asking themselves for the last 20 years. How do we stop these modern monetary theorists from having any voice? Well, first of all, they say, thank God that the University of Chicago and the right-wing neo-fascists all control the major economic journals. We're not going to let the graduates of the UMKC get hired, and we're not going to let them publish in any respectable journal. And that means that when these graduates get their PhD and they want a job, we're going to make sure that they can't be hired by any respectable university, and we're going to isolate them and make fun of them and tell them that, just like Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. They are unpersons. That's why I'm on your show and not on MSNBC.
Well, MSNBC's audience is shrinking by the day, and our audience is increasing by the day. So I don't know. There might be some hope there, but I say that kind of joking. But seriously, I think it was Jefferson who said if he could have a functional government or a functional publication, like a functional news media, he'd rather have a functional news media, because if people don't have the information they need, clean information to make decisions, they're not capable of righting the wrongs. And so there is some hope there that the rise of podcasts, the rise of Substack, independent journalism actually does seem to be making a turnover in some meaningful way that I think is really important. But
I think that people need to know what it is to ask for. And so if the economy is grinding to a halt and everyone has so much debt that they literally cannot make any movement forward, what are the solutions that you can imagine people, in an ideal world, what are the solutions that you imagine implementing that would help turn this around?
Well, that's why I began to write my history of debt with Harvard, beginning with antiquity to the modern times. How have societies handled the problems of debt growing faster than the ability to be paid? Well, in my Killing the Host, I show the problem is that debts grow exponentially. The Babylonians had an economic model of the economy, and in 1800 BC, it was more mathematically sophisticated than any model that has come out of any university or the National Bureau in the West. And the model was quite simple. We know what it is because we have the textbooks that they trained the Babylonian scribes in, who were the writers. They asked, how long does it take a debt to double? They said every rate of interest is a doubling time, and at the commercial rate in Babylonia, 20% simple interest, quinquennially calculated. It takes 5 years for a debt to double at the going interest rates. How long does it take to quadruple? Well, that's 10 years. How long to multiply 8 times? That's 15 years. And then finally, how long does it take to multiply 64 times? Well, that's 30 years. Well, needless to say, they all saw that no economy can multiply its debt 64 times in 30 years. So you had a number of rulers cancel debts on their 30th year, but usually much before that. They also had a model of how fast does the economy grow? Well, we have models of we have a herd of cattle. How fast does a herd of cattle grow? And they found it's an S curve. So the economy grows in an S curve. but the debts grow up exponentially, you're going to have a gap between the amount of debt and the ability of the economy to pay out of its production. I did these charts in an essay that I did in one of the University of Missouri at Kansas City publications for their Minsky meetings, and I repeated this chart in a cover story for Harper's Magazine in, I think, 2007. That I got credit for the Financial Times for being one of the 8 economists who'd forecast exactly when the bank crisis, financial crisis was going to occur, and I showed why it would occur, and the Financial Times reproduced the charts, the Babylonian economic model that I'd had. So other countries realized early on, before there was an oligarchy to promote junk economics, they didn't have any Milton Friedman, fortunately, to advise them. They would cancel the debts. That's why, as I said, throughout Greece and Rome, the population knew how to cure things. They wanted a debt cancellation. There were revolutions from Greece, Athens, Sparta. The kings finally of Sparta canceled the debts and were overthrown when the oligarchs in neighboring Greek cities called in Rome to come in and just wipe out the Greeks. And in Rome, there was no debt cancellation, and we know what happened to it. We know what the solution is. If you do not cancel the debts, then there's going to be a polarization, and the 1% of creditors are going to grow everything. The basic principle is obvious enough. Debts that can't be paid won't be paid. But the question is, how won't they be paid? Either they'll be canceled, but if you don't cancel them, they're going to be paid the way Obama solved the problem. Let's just foreclose. Let's throw out 10 million American families. Boy, they'll give me enough money for my next campaign that I'll be reelected in 2012. And that's just what happened. So you screw the people by standing up, by not canceling the debts and letting them be stuck with fictitious, fraudulent junk mortgages, and you'll make the 1% rich. That's your choice. Are you going to be for the 1% of creditors or for the 99% that's in the increasingly indebted economy at large?
Is it possible for somebody to step into office and implement a policy of debt cancellation?
Well, they've tried. That's what I was going to say. I mean, like the hand-wringing over the cancellation of student debt to me seems indicative of just how cold the climate is, because you saw people that seemed to me perfectly rational being like, well, they took the loans, they got to pay them. And it's like, well, they took the loans at 17 years old without a full understanding of what it meant to take a loan like that. And everybody along the line benefited from giving them the loans, from the universities to the banks. And so
there's like a lot of buyer's remorse too, right? Where people were like, well, I had to pay off my debt, and
lots of people, they have this moralistic attitude of like, well, they won't learn their lesson if you forgive the debts. And it just seems to me a desire to punish in this almost Old Testament way of, you made your bed, now lie in it, because if you were responsible, you would have majored in computer programming instead of anthropology.
Well, you're saying just what Julius Caesar said. He worked with Catiline and said, there's only one way to cancel the debts, and that's the revolution. If you don't kill them, they're going to kill you. You got to have war. And so Catiline tried to start a war, but it didn't work, and the oligarchs beat him. And then Caesar accumulated a lot of money, marched with the troops on Rome, became elected consul, and he was killed. So in America, we have the Supreme Court. You don't need Brutus and the senators to kill him. You just have the Supreme Court that's been put in place to say, oh, I'm sorry, that's not legal. Or you have Mr. Biden going to the parliamentary parliamentary advisor, some, I guess, lady who just graduated from law school, say, oh, you can't do that. And you'll say, okay, we're not going to fight. We're not even going to try. Remember, Biden didn't want to cancel the debt. It was Biden who introduced and forced the law that the credit card companies and banks wanted, that student debts cannot be wiped out by bankruptcy. Biden says, there's one group of people I really want to screw that I don't like. That's the intellectuals who go to college. Let's really break them. Let's make sure that they'll get a debt they can't pay, and every other American can wipe out their debt in bankruptcy, but not the students. We'll screw them. And that's what he did. Biden is the enemy of students, the enemy of everything that he pretends to stand for. He was thoroughly rotten to the core. And the problem isn't that he's senile now, it's that he's thoroughly rotten.
But isn't that the case for any elected official within this system? Like, it seems impossible to reform this without a total collapse of the system. And my next question is that if we have a total collapse of the system, we have to make sure that our new version of the Constitution, how we formulate our government, is adapted to this new way of thinking. What would the major change in that Constitution be?
You have to completely rewrite it from scratch.
Okay. And what would you change?
Not necessarily what would you change, because if you're rewriting it from scratch,
I understand,
everything,
but
what would you write in it?
How would you write it? Yeah.
You basically have look at what China has done. China doesn't have this kind of a debt problem because the government is the central banker. The government can create whatever it wants. The one thing, you want to design an economy without a central bank. The central bank is the Treasury. A central bank is to prevent the Treasury from making public money, and to make sure that the central bank represents the commercial banks to indebt the rest of the economy rather than the economy working free from debt. There are a bunch of economic principles, and these are the principles that I'm trying to get the global South countries to get. They're a simple market principle. If a debtor cannot repay the debt, then it's a bad loan. The creditor loses because instead of doing what creditors claim to do, we make loans to people who can repay. That's our job. They've made loans that can't be repaid. The loan's wiped out. You have the ability of debtors to declare bankruptcy when they are unable to pay a debt that is accumulated. You also have a tax system. What is pushing up the debt in America's economy is basically real estate debt, mortgage debt. 80% of loans by American banks are mortgage loans. Most of these mortgages are to pay for land rent, for they capitalize the land rent into a value of all of this rented location that isn't created by the landlords, that's created by the public community. You would have a tax system that taxes away economic rent. That's exactly what Adam Smith wanted, what the French physiocrats wanted, what John Stuart Mill was all about. The whole 19th century said, we don't want people to go into debt to pay a rentier class. We'll finance the budget by land rent. We're not going to tax labor, because that'll mean you have to pay labor more wages to pay the taxes. We're not going to tax industrial capital because that means they won't have enough profit to reinvest. We're going to tax unearned income. We're going to tax the land rent and the natural resource rent, the oil and mineral rent, if there's, we're not going to permit public infrastructure to be monopolized and screw people like the Indiana toll roads or Chicago's parking meters. We're going to keep all public investment in the public domain, and we're going to supply it either for freely, like medical care or education, as is done throughout much of the world, or at least at subsidized prices. So inexpensive transportation, inexpensive communication, so that you make the economy competitive. So there has to be a different tax system, a different bank, credit creation and monetary system to begin with. And of course, you'll have progressive taxation, not the regressive taxation today.
Does it involve the abolition of usury in general?
No.
Private usury?
No, the Babylonians never got rid of usury. There's a reason. There are reasons to pay interest, and the idea is that you can make a loan at interest if somebody benefits from having interest. But if the interest becomes, you don't charge interest on something that people need as a basic cost of living. You make sure that everybody has their basic needs guaranteed as a human right to have the be able to afford basic needs: a home of your own, medical care, education, and if you want to go into debt to either start your own enterprise or consume more, yes, there's a reason for interest. But when you can't pay the debt, then you have to either forfeit your property or you wipe. The lender has made a bad loan, but you don't become a slave to the creditor as in antiquity. You don't become a bond person having to end up working your whole life just to pay the creditor.
Mm.
I mean, one of the ways in which I think that this functions right now is as a mechanism to drive people's behaviors. So the fact that the housing market is insane and mortgage rates are, I think that they're up at like 6% right now. It feels like a mechanism to perpetually encourage people to continue renting rather than owning.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of interest.
And the question is the economy becoming richer as a result? The GDP, National Income Account, said the economy is getting richer because now housing services are more valuable. And so our housing services are more valuable than those of China or Japan or Russia or Venezuela because we charge so much more and we're willing to pay the bank so much more. Are we getting richer or are we getting poorer by high housing prices?
Well, yeah, exactly. But it seems like it is the system is so just tangled up in the activism of special interest groups that it's hard for me to imagine a situation where you would change the economic conditions sufficiently to allow all people to own a home. Because I have family that lives in the Bay Area. And so they're always sending me articles about the housing market in the Bay Area. And there was one recently in the San Jose Mercury News, which was about the fact that the average mortgage was around $10,000 a month in San Jose. And so no one in their right mind can do that because you can rent. I mean, rent is still expensive, but you can rent a place for $4,000. And so no one in their right mind is going to buy a house under those conditions. And so how do you change those conditions? Because everybody wants to live in San Jose.
I mean, it seems like he's saying a collapse is necessary, essentially.
Yeah, like, is a collapse necessary?
That seems to be, it has never been solved in any other way than a collapse or a revolution.
And the thing that prevents revolution is the dream that you can get in on the game and it can work for you.
Well, not only that, but the fact that everybody is in the game, because anybody who owns stocks or bonds or has a 401k is inherently tied to the continued function of the system. And I don't know about most people, I don't want to say that, but there seem to be lots of people who are doing all right with that. They have their investments, they're perfectly happy as long as the big corporations function. Their Vanguard index funds are traded in such a way to maintain their rise in price. And so the people who are able to afford a 401k, which is anyone with a decent wage job that works at a corporation, they're like, well, I don't really want it to change.
Well, this is the big trick that was pulled on American labor after World War II. In 2006, I wrote a big cover story for Harper's on this, and the labor unions were tricked into basically having pensions privatized and corporatized. And so the corporations had to actually spend money and labor had to contribute to pay money into by buying stock into the financial sector. This trick was organized by the financial sector, realizing that now we have labor socialism, pension fund socialism, it was called. The pension funds are going to put money into the stock market to make us, the 1% that owns 70% of the stocks, richer. richer. We're going to get richer and richer by all these suckers, the workers who are paying into the pension funds that are pushing up the values of the stock we have. And labor is going to make us richer, not by exploiting them or by hiring them to sell their products at a profit, but by making them use their savings and the corporate savings into pension funds to make us speculators richer in the stock and the bond markets. That's exactly the problem. Pensions should be public, not private. They should be pay as you go, and you should not have to pay labor's pensions by giving money to the financial sector, whose economic role is to destroy employment, to offshore employment, to deindustrialize the country, and to do exactly what the financial sector has done to the U.S. economy. That was the false detour that the American economy took after World War II, not making pensions the way they are in, I think, Germany and other countries, public in character, but you have to financialize it to make the financial 1% rich, the stockbrokers and the bank. That was the con job, the ideological con job that they pulled.
Can you explain the way that a public pension system would work?
The government will simply pay pensions like it pays for medical care, like it pays for education in other countries. People who retire deserve a wage. This is what the fight is largely in France right now. That they're having a revolution there. A pension should be a public right. Just like healthcare is a public right. In education, you have a right to live and not starve when you retire.
But we don't have that in this country in any way. We're so far from that in this country. The idea of public, again, so debt forgiveness is basically a moral question of you picked the wrong major, you deserve to suffer. If we forgive debts, we will encourage people to make the wrong decisions when they go to college. The lack of public health care, I think, also has to do with that, because I see a lot of people talking about the fact that if you make it public, people will use it more. And if they use it more, it's going to be worse. And I'm like, isn't that more of a reflection of how screwed up our healthcare system that you would that the end result would be more consumption as opposed to a healthcare system that helped people get better?
I guess you're talking about ideological suicide. My major audience isn't in the United States. My major audience is in China. And Asian countries. And I spend where my books are typeset, and I spend most of my lectures over there. My audience typically is 650,000 people per lecture, larger than I can get in the United States, because other countries are actually trying to work to solve these problems. And most people in America, like you, realize that a reasonable economic solution is not possible without a revolution, and we're nowhere near a revolutionary situation.
Do you think it would?
Not going to happen?
Yeah, it seems like people have to really be pinched to the point of breaking before they're willing to sacrifice the comfort of their momentary situation in order to actually change things.
No, actually, it's the reverse. Most revolutions have happened when people are just beginning to get a little bit richer, and when they're just beginning to get a little bit richer, that's when they get they're thinking, they have more courage, and they're able to do things. Once they're impoverished, they just give up. They're depressed and they're lost. And so I think the American wage earning class is more depressed than ambitious right now. Plus, it's the Democratic Party's work to make sure that there's almost the population has almost every kind of identity except that of a wage earner. You can have an ethnic identity, a gender identity, a national identity. You cannot have an identity as a wage earner. That's autocracy.
It seems like you're saying that the revolution would come from the wealthy class then, if it was going to happen.
Surprisingly enough, that's what's happened throughout history. It was, if you look at who were the Jewish prophets in Judea and Israel, in the Jewish Bible, they all came from pretty good families. Most revolutions are led by the upper middle class people. In Greece and Rome, they were led by members of the aristocracy, but not so rich members, sort of like the poorer members of the aristocracy. That in Rome, when Rome made Christianity the religion, it was mainly the wives of the rich people who converted them all. So yes, it's the wealthy people, ironically enough, who've led the revolution. Neither Lenin nor Trotsky were members of the working class.
You know, it's interesting because a really long time ago, I was thinking about the Vietnam War, and it kind of occurred to me that the reason that the Vietnam War ended was because the middle class, the wealthy, began to protest. While it was just marginalized communities, it was kind of like, well, we can do whatever we want to. But the minute that the middle class that actually had the economic power began to be upset with it, that was when the entire thing collapsed.
It was a draft dodging war, so it wasn't really. They were against it because they didn't want to be drafted. But there were also some middle class people that actually didn't like the war. Although right after the war, they decided they liked American imperialism generally, as long as they weren't drafted.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it's a coincidence that the ancient Sumerian kings were obligated to a divine role in society?
They weren't. Everybody thought of themselves as being subordinate to somebody else. Children were subordinate to their parents. Parents had complete control over them. Families were subordinate to local politicians. The king, all the way up to the pharaoh. The pharaoh was subordinate to the god, and the Mesopotamian rulers had to follow the god's direction. But what were the gods? The gods were the definition of what is a socially balanced society.
Exactly.
How do we tie society together? They were subordinate to an ideology of keeping society well balanced and integrated and not impoverished. And you don't have that today. The leaders today are subordinate to how can we help our campaign contributors tear society apart? And if you're Mr. Biden, how can I make squeeze labor even harder? How do I make sure that the railroad strike workers are not unionized? How can I break the unions so that I can get more campaign contributors through the railroad owners? That's how they think. So instead of having a justice god, they have the devil.
Yeah, there's a great Dylan song, "You Gotta Serve Somebody," and it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. And it's true just of human existence. You if you're not aiming towards something good, you're probably not aiming towards something good, right? You're aiming towards something bad.
Well, at the upper echelons, you're aiming for something. Like the people who occupy the highest rank of society are all aiming for something. They're all aspiring. They're all pushing towards something. You don't accidentally end up the president of a company or the president of a country. You get there because you have aimed to be in that position over the course of your entire life.
You say position, but you aim to get that position not by having anything that you want to accomplish. Biden or Obama or Trump didn't care a bit. They didn't have any ideal they wanted to accomplish. They wanted to serve their campaign contributors. They said, I will serve anybody's ideal. I don't care. Give me money behind your ideal, and my ideals are up for auction. Whoever gives me the biggest campaign contribution, that's the policy I'm going to support.
How do we fix that one in the new Constitution?
Well, you're not going to let private campaign contributions determine who's elected. In other countries, all the European countries, the government gives each party and its own think tank a given stipend to make its case. There's no private. For instance, the Christian Democrats have I guess, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung and their own think tank. The Social Democrats have the Buckler Foundation. The Die Linke Party has the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And the government, everybody has the same budget if they're running. The government says, here's how much you have to spend. Here's how we're organizing the debates. Here's all this. It's not our governments are not put up for auction. America has privatized, and Milton Friedmanized the election process, and other countries have not done that.
And so what is the defense against that seems to have fallen with the Citizens United decision, because Citizens United created a condition where there's no limit on private campaign contributions, which means that there's no real limit to the amount of influence that you can purchase.
Yes.
Is there a way back from that?
No. Not unless Biden is going to invite the Supreme Court into his office and say, there's nothing personal here, but I'm afraid I have to shoot you all so I can appoint a new Supreme Court that's going to have a completely different ruling than you have. That's not going to happen. They're going to die a natural death, and we'll all be dead by the time there's a change in that ruling, I think.
Okay, so what about something like worker ownership?
But that's a real one way. If you really want to screw workers, have them do worker ownership. This was the plan. Corporations were said, let's have worker owners. I think that's what the Chicago Tribune had. We're going to give. And that's the Milton. That was the Chilean. That's the fascist solution in Chile that Chicago thought of. Very clever. They'll have workers' ownership. You're going to actually have stock in the company, and you're going to, we're going to give you the stock, so you're the owners of the company. We're going to invest all the stock for you. And so in Chile, they would have a factory, let's say, and they'd give the workers the stock, and you'd have the factory and that corporation. You'd also incorporate a bank. And the bank would make loans to the corporation. The bank would make loans to the worker ownership corporation, and they'd then pay the loans to themselves as a dividend. They'd leave the company bankrupt, and they'd say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Yes, you owned the company, but the company you own has just wiped out the stockholders. We have to pay the creditors." So worker ownership is a way of fooling the workers and basically wiping them out. I discussed this in my Harper's article too, and I think I've done that in my Killing the Host and other books. So
but I think this isn't quite the worker ownership that I'm imagining, because worker ownership, like in the Mondragon Corporation, stock is entirely restricted to the people that are working at any given moment. As soon as you leave the company, you have to sell your stocks back to the company. So there's no outside investors whatsoever in a pure worker ownership scheme.
And the Mondragon Corporation has also been enormously successful because they have their own banks, they have their own healthcare system, they have their own university.
All those are good parts. The Basque labor unions brought me over one year to go around and lecture to them, and the problem is that the Mondragon is against labor unionization. So yes, the workers own the stock, but they're not unionized, and there are some other problems there. And the Basques have a lot of critique of the Mondragon. Although the idea that you're saying, the dream of the Mondragon is a very good dream, but you want to avoid some of the problems that it has in practice.
Can we talk about the problems? Because I've always looked at it as being kind of the pinnacle of.
Well, tell them about the tour we did.
Yeah, so basically, after we finished grad school, we had no concrete idea of what we wanted to do. And so we were thinking that, okay, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll start a business. But we don't want to start a business that suffers from all of the same capitalist problems that most businesses suffer from. We had read a lot of Dick Wolf, a lot about Mondragon, and so we realized that there was a lot of worker-owned corporations in the United States, and so we did a tour of them. Initially, we wanted to make a movie, but we had no idea what we were doing, so we took a lot of footage that was garbage in the end of the day. But we did talk to probably, 25 or 30 different businesses across the country that had varying degrees of success with the model. And it was everything from, bakeries at the low end to this place in Wisconsin called Isthmus Manufacturing, which creates robotic machines for assembly lines. And they were quite successful in the sense that it was exclusively the employees. They owned the stock. They were able to make their decisions. They were able to make money. They were one of the only American manufacturing companies that didn't have to downsize during the 2008 crash, because they were able to get together and be like, okay, so instead of firing people, we're going to lower wages for a while, make sure that everybody makes it through the crisis, and then we'll start growing on the other side. And that's exactly what they did.
Well, that's not playing the game. That's you're supposed to make money by screwing the workers. Of course, there are some employers that, of course, can say we're not going to borrow from a bank and wipe out the workers' stock holdings. And I'm sure you're able to find some, but that is not a significant percentage of the economy, and you're not going to get the biggest firms to do that. And especially if let's say you're an oil company like Standard Oil. How could you do this at a big oil company where you have huge capital investments? If you're going to have sharing the profits with workers, the more labor there is relative to capital, the easier there is to do. But once there are investments in capital, and once you issue stock, that becomes a problem. Suppose you're one of these honest companies. I think Ben and Jerry's had something like that going. They tried to do something like you suggested. They issued stock. The stock was bought out by a big corporation, and all of a sudden, the big corporation took it over and did things its way.
And that's the story that we heard over and over again about failed worker ownership enterprises, was that they started taking their stock outside of the company. So the system only works in an absolute sense that under no circumstances can anybody who's not a worker own the stock to it. And I mean, there's probably pitfalls, but it certainly solves the problem of polluting the rivers that your workers are living in and things like that, where, in the modern scheme, the investors are just trying to recoup their funds at any cost. They don't care what happens to the town that the factory is in, but that doesn't seem to be a problem with worker ownership. So
I wonder if in order to lay out the potential problems, because I think that you're right, that as long as you maintain these strict rules, that
it has to be absolute.
It works. Can you lay out some of the problems that you saw with Mondragon?
I didn't look that much into it, so I'd much rather you talk to a Basque labor leader about that than me, because I think I might. I haven't been to Spain for quite a few years now, so I'd rather avoid that. But so even in companies without a stock, suppose you're in the Soviet Union under Stalin or Khrushchev in the late 1980s, there were a lot of companies that didn't have to borrow, and their leaders all got rich. The managers got rich by embezzlement, and they embezzled money largely through Latvia, I found out. And there was so much money that was embezzled by the corporate leaders, the KGB, and the army that there was a huge looting of public enterprises. You're going to have looters anywhere. You need a very good accounting so that everybody really knows what's happening. And we get into technicalities here that are way beyond what the topic of our conversation is about where the American economy is going. But it's really in order for what you're suggesting to work, you need a different mentality that goes just beyond what you believe and the small percentage of people who agree with you believe.
Okay, so one thing that I'm thinking of is what about stock buybacks? Because so from what I understand of stock buybacks, it's, again, it could be totally mistaken, but it's that a corporation purchases its own shares and is now no longer as much of a public company as it was previously.
No, just as much as it was before. They just essentially the shares are destroyed. It doesn't really have them. Stock buybacks. Liskanik has talked about this. I have a whole chapter of it in Killing the Host. If you buy back your own stock, you're making money not by investing to increase the means of production by building more plant and equipment and output. You're just pushing your financial engineering, not industrial engineering. Stock buybacks should be heavily penalized. For every dollar of stock, you have to pay a fine of $10. Basically, that should be the rule. And if you do that for more than a year, you're automatically sent to jail for 20 years.
Can you elaborate on why they're so bad? I mean, jailing.
Because
Okay, go ahead.
making money for stockholders and the financial sector doesn't add to production at all. It doesn't. If you have that much money, you could pay the workers more. You could invest more. If you don't have anything to do with the profits you're making, then you shouldn't have that big profits. Lower your prices instead of charging exorbitant price. Buying stock, making money by financial engineering is completely unproductive, and the whole industry should, as Keynes said, all these people should be unemployed. Keynes said we don't need them at all, and he was right.
Okay,
As
so
stock manipulators.
So if, let's say a corporation decided to do a long-term stock buyback, and what they did is instead of destroying the shares, they would then distribute them to the employees exclusively. So so you could take a public company.
You don't need to buy them back. You can just give them. I see what you're saying. That's so utopian. I don't even want to get into that. I'm good at describing how the economy works. There's no way that I can give you're looking for a solution to the problems that there are today, and we don't have a problem. We have a quandary. There's no solution to a quandary. You're trying to solve it. Forget it. You can't solve it. It's nice for you to think, wouldn't it be nice if they could work this way? Of course it would be nice if corporations could buy back the stocks and give it to the workers. But look at how bizarre this would be for an oil company where you have, suppose you have 10 employees that make $10 billion a year for the company because the 10 employees run the well. Are you really going to say, well, buy back the stock and 10 employees, they each get $1 billion? That's crazy. And that would be the case with any highly capital-intensive corporation. It would make some labor people much richer than the rest of the labor force. It's an antisocial solution to benefit a small group against the other, and it's so dysfunctional that I'm sure that the Chicago School would love to push it because it can't possibly be done because it's so unfair and predatory.
But let's take something like Walmart, for example. So Walmart is notorious for generating an enormous amount of profit for the owners, very little profit for the wage earners. And so let's say that some revolutionary arm of the Walton family becomes the controlling CEO and takes over the board of the company. And they're like, you know what? We have a legacy of doing really, really screwed up things to our workers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to buy back all of our shares, and as we buy them back, we will redistribute them equally to the workers.
Why not just pay the workers more? Instead of making the profits, why not ease the working conditions? Why not say we're going to have a 4-day work week and we're going to have people work 6 hours a day? We're going to pay them more. We're going to give them more vacations. We're going to give them free medical care, and we're going to contribute to their pensions. Why do it financially? You don't need a financial solution to a real economic problem. The real economic problem is workers' conditions. What is their standard of living? It's not how they're going to own share in a company that acts by being predatory and making money in a predatory way, big profit and profiteering like Walmart does.
And it seems like the fact of the matter is you don't want the workers to be comfortable, because when they're comfortable, they're functionally revolutionary.
Yes, I think that's certainly how employers feel.
Interesting. I mean, you're painting a really grim picture of a problem that has absolutely no solution.
I don't think so.
No, you don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we've outlined a new constitution here, basically. And I actually want to...
a revolution, not a constitution yet, a revolution.
Well, I don't think a revolution is a good idea unless we have a better idea of what comes next. I'm actually really opposed to a revolution that doesn't have a better solution in mind. And so my job as a citizen is to imagine what that new state looks like so that I can be sure to back the right revolutionary party, essentially. And so, wait, I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anything, too. So the better state would have debt forgiveness for basic human rights services like housing, food, healthcare. It would have no private finance for elections. it would restrict usury to the commercial sector, so the non-earning services are taxed the most. And then it would be oriented towards some sort of higher power that essentially meant the social harmony of the citizens and the well-being of the citizens. Did I miss anything?
Sure, in principle, that's a good start. And we've gone 3 hours already, so I can't get into more detail. But that's basically it.
Is there anyone that you have come across as you have wandered through the halls of power who you really admire?
Well, I was the economic advisor to Dennis Kucinich, and he was a very good guy. He'd be the guy that I'd recommend.
I went to high school with his daughter, coincidentally. Jackie. Shout out, Jackie Kucinich.
Is that, I mean, as a whole, at the upper echelons of the world, do you find people that are oriented towards good, or do you largely find people that are oriented for their own benefit and accumulation
in the
of
short
power?
term?
In the short term, yeah.
It's very hard for me to know. Most people try to benefit themselves by doing good if they're in a country like China. And I've spent a lot of time talking to Central Committee people there and faculty members and students there, and they all seem to want to do good. I remember 10 years ago when I was lecturing in China, I got a feeling from the students that I talked to, they really felt that they could change society. They felt that Milton Friedman and the neoliberals had come in to Shanghai and had pressed sort of the privatization that had been very fortunate because it did unleash a lot of entrepreneurial invention, but it also led to a lot of local corruption. And they wanted to go into the government and really clean out the corruption and make it work the way it should. And I don't think there's any other country that I'd been in where people really felt that they could play a role in making the economy work much better, and in the process, by supporting these objectives, their own career would be taking off as a good administrator.
But I know that, okay, so I don't want to create a dichotomy of, that the United States is better than China or China is better than the United States, because I think that it's one of those topics that you could probably start to take apart and point into totally opposite directions. But it seems like the state is particularly repressive in China. Like we saw what happened during COVID. Right? And so people were locked into their apartments. People were basically at the mercy of the government saying, you know what? No, this is what we're going to do. You have no voice. You have no option. And it was pretty dark to look at from the outside, because for all of the problems that the United States has and for all of the political wrangling that happened over the course of the last few years, at the very least, we weren't barricading people inside their apartments.
Well, they were very frightened, and once the problem is when they raised the restrictions, my faculty friends from Hong Kong went to China, included the whole group that does my typesetting, and everyone except one got COVID when they went there, and some of them got long COVID. So I don't know how one could have handled the situation differently. They were desperate at trying to prevent themselves from getting sick. Of course, it was draconian. My wife and I haven't gone out to restaurants since COVID began here. We haven't gone on trips, and I haven't taken airplanes because I'm trying to protect myself from COVID. I wear masks. I go into the city only to the dentist, basically. So that's a real problem. I don't think that's inherent in either the China's system or America's system or any political system. It's how a government was operating under distress conditions where it really didn't know how to protect itself. So I think that's a whole different set of problems from the kind of economic dynamics that we've been talking about.
I mean, I had some friends, particularly when I was in New York in grad school, that had come from China to the United States. Actually, most of the people I worked with, a lot of the people I worked with. And I got this sense that they felt like, well, first of all, they wanted to be here. So that's an interesting point on its own. but there was this sense of restriction. Like it was very difficult to find out what was happening in the world inside of China. There's a lot of control of the information flows. There's a very real sense of you can't speak out against the powerful parties. And of course, that's creeping into America now too, which I never would have thought would have happened. But do you think, like, what are some of the problems that China's experiencing despite the economic boom?
All I can talk about are economic problems. I can't talk about political problems. The economic problem is the same problem that America has in the Constitution between federal and local localities. How are the local villages in China going to finance their own spending? Well, one of the ways they have it is to sell off the public land to developers. Ends up being debt financed. They do have, even though the government creates the money, they have a debt problem and a real estate debt problem. So these are economic problems, and they're trying to figure out some way of solving them politically. But every single country in the world today has the same problem between federal and state and local. Certainly that occurs in the United States. So a lot of these problems that countries are having today have a common denominator among them. I don't want to I'm not a specialist in China's economy. I'm a specialist in the U.S. and the European economies.
Is there, in the new constitution, in the better state, is there a shift in balance of power towards the localities as opposed to towards the federation?
I haven't even thought about making a new constitution.
Well, we have been thinking about it all afternoon.
Yeah.
Regardless,
in principle, I know it's there, but it takes so long to draft something like that. It's just outside of the area that I talk about.
Well, okay, like maybe an easier way of putting it is: would it be economically beneficial to put more power in the hands of the localities versus the federations?
The question is, would it be political? How do you compare economically beneficial and politically beneficial? There's certainly, one of the problems in America certainly is states' rights. That's always been pretty bad, and it's the fact that you can have a state like Delaware having very pro-corporate laws that the whole country's corporations want to live in Delaware, and have people like Biden taking their case against the voters as a whole, or states that have no usury limits. So all the credit card companies move to the Northwest state. So how are you going to get that kind of a balance? This is a kind of political thing that just isn't my topic.
But so in terms of a more stable economic system, do you imagine a larger federal government that takes onto itself more and more services like healthcare, like infrastructure, like housing, and is in charge of creating the stock of that is then distributed to the people?
That sounds very bureaucratic. There must be the fact is you obviously need a symbiosis, and that symbiosis is going to depend largely on the political character of the country to begin with. So I'm not sure there's any one size fits all solution to that. But certainly you don't want a Stalinist type economy. And what enabled China to take off was, amazingly enough, Milton Friedman going and said, let private enterprise develop too. And so I think they said, well, one reason that the federal government in China doesn't control what's happening locally, the local mayors have a lot of control over their local villages. And I think the philosophy in China was, let 100 flowers bloom. Let's see what works. So I think you need to go through an experimental stage. You need some kind of, you'd almost say, political competition to see what works. And I think that's how they began, and it certainly worked for them.
Have you looked much into special economic zones?
No, they're usually tax-free zones to benefit international corporations.
Yeah, because I know of a couple that are, in South America, one in particular that's in Chile somewhere, that's kind of this libertarian Bitcoin stronghold where a bunch of people have decided that they don't want to be, they don't want to bow to the United States government or whatever government is hosting them.
No, I don't want to get into. We're sort of at the end of the discussion. I don't even want to get into libertarianism. I'm not even willing to waste my time on it. It's loathsome, and the people in such zones with that ideology are loathsome.
Because they shirk responsibility for the infrastructure?
No, they're just antisocial personalities, and I want it's. I have limited time in my life to spend, and I don't want to spend my time having to fight in the gutter, in the intellectual gutter, with University of Chicago libertarians or these people. I'd rather talk to intelligent people, not to economists.
Do you identify with a certain school?
I'd define myself as a classical economist. Again, the whole 19th century, a classical economy, from the physiocrats and Adam Smith right down through Simon Patton in the United States, the first economic professor at the first business school, to Thorstein Veblen.
And is anyone currently doing a good job of teaching this kind of economics that you look to and you really respect?
Well, most people who are teaching it just got disgusted and quit, like Steve Kane, who you had on your show. There are really not many. A lot of the UMKC people went to Bard College to work at the Levy Institute and teach there, but and there are a few UMKC graduates elsewhere, but they've all moved on pretty much.
Is there any will for people like you and Steve to start a new institution that could rival the University of Chicago, or is that just too hard of a task to take on?
It costs a lot of money to start. Somebody would have to decide, we want to have these people come over. Well, I'm 84 years old, so I'm not going to begin teaching again. I spend all my time writing. So yes, if some, just like Warren Mosler tried to fund UMKC, he did it, but then he was supposed to get a matching fund of $1 million from the Missouri or Kansas City Congress. And once they found out that he wasn't a right-wing Republican, they welched on the deal. And the first thing they did was fire the neoliberal department head. And so the head of the university made her the dean in charge of their financing. So, you're really going to have a fight in trying to introduce reality economics anywhere where the whole academic system is based on unreality economics.
Do you think that it's possible that there's an super ethical billionaire out there that would be interested in funding something like this? Or do you think that there's something inherent to accumulating such capital that prevents you from thinking that way?
Nobody's told me about any such funding. I mean, the big the big foundations like a Ford Foundation and George Soros are not interested in the kind of ideas that I'm talking about. So I don't know of any.
Yeah, I mean, I want to believe that it's possible to accumulate massive quantities of wealth and then to maintain a philosophical and ideological alignment that then wants to help people live better lives. But I have yet to really see that happen.
You've fallen for junk economics. The idea that as people become richer, they don't need money so much. The Greeks had it right. Wealth is addictive. Once you have wealth, you want more and more of it. It's addictive. That's what Aristophanes' plays were about. That's what Aristotle was talking about. That's what Socrates was talking about. Wealth is addictive, and and if you have kids, once you inherit wealth, your IQ goes down 10%, and the next generation it goes down another 30%, and so they don't have the imagination. There's something. Wealth seems to be like a disease that attacks the brain cells and the imagination, and you just have a lower and lower self-esteem because your wealth is so much more important than you are, and you just end up serving it, and you're into a blind alley.
Well, how do you account for these multi-generational super wealthy families like the Rockefellers or the Habsburgs or something?
I knew David Rockefeller, and he was the grandson of John D., and he was certainly always very nice to me, supported my ideas, and let me write whatever I wanted to, and said that if the bank didn't find it in their interest, they wouldn't publish it, but he wanted to know what I was finding out. However, by the time he was head of Chase Manhattan, he was surrounded by people who said, "We're here to protect you from people who just want to take advantage of your money." And so he had a lot of people saying that they wanted to protect him, and they introduced him to all sorts of international foundations that you'd probably call fascist. What are some of the big? Before there was Davos, there was the Bilderberg. People were friends of his. He let himself be on the Trilateral Commission. He wanted to do the right thing, and he genuinely wanted to do the right thing. He'd be your ideal. When the Treasury wanted him to build a Chase Manhattan Bank in Saigon so that the American Army could put money in a U.S. bank and it wouldn't end up in a French bank turned over to de Gaulle, he said, okay, even though we're going to lose money on it, building a whole bank without windows, I want to be a good citizen and do the right thing, and I'll do it. He wanted to do the right thing, but he was surrounded by peer pressure, by all the people around him saying, here are people that want to help you, Bilderberg and the Trilateral Commission, all of these. And so he later, I think at one point, he said, well, maybe I wasn't too careful in some of the people that I associated with. And I thought, that he ended up being sort of a figurehead. And many of the people who inherit a lot of wealth end up more as being figureheads than deciding like Caesar did, and some of the other Roman leaders, or Cleisthenes in Athens. I'm really going to reshape society, and here's how I'm going to do it. I don't see any wealthy person that really wants to reshape society. They want to be a good citizen for a society that doesn't want to do good in the world.
And so what do you think is the most important lesson that we can take from antiquity?
99% tax on inherited wealth. You'll raise the IQ and the imagination and the courage of a family so they won't be crushed by inheritance anymore. And the need to cancel. They realize that if you don't wipe out the debts, they're going to lead to a dark age and austerity, and you're going to end up looking like one of the victims of an IMF stabilization program.
Well, I am. Yeah. This has been really, really valuable to me because I really struggle to imagine what the better state would look like. And I feel like you've answered a lot of questions about that for us. And
I can't talk about the better state. I can talk about a less bad economy. I can talk about what's wrong with the economy rather than better than I can talk about a better state. Once you're disconnected,
in so much as the state is responsible for the economic outcome, and of course that is a huge part of the puzzle. So yes, it's not the whole picture.
But if you begin by saying what's wrong with the economy, that diagnosis is going to lead to the remedy.
Nice.
I like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely riveting for me. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you coming by so much.
Yeah.
So when are you going to transcribe it all?
Soon. And so in the next few weeks, we'll have it live and ready to go.
Live on? Are you going to write it out? So you're going to transcribe it. You had promised to originally.
We'll find a way to do it.
Yeah, you'd promised to, and that people are not going to listen for 3 hours.
You'd be surprised. Yeah.
Well, the reason that I agree to go on, I never go on a show that people are not going to be willing to transcribe it. So I got to hold you to that.
We'll do it.
All right, we'll do it. We'll transcribe this one.
Okay.
It's honestly something we've been meaning to do for a while. We have a website that's kind of a waste of space right now. And we've been meaning to figure out some program to transcribe. Right now, it's just Anastasia and I doing everything. So we edit the podcast, we research the guests, we reach out. Like it's a more than full-time job. And so these things kind of fall by the wayside.
But many, many people have been asking us for transcriptions. You are the first guest that is holding us to doing it. And so you will be the dawn of a new era for Demystify Sci. I appreciate
other
that.
shows have said the same thing, and they say, "Boy, we're really glad we started. Now it increases the viewership and the
Yeah,
readership."
I think that you're onto something.
Yep.
But I genuinely appreciate how much time you gave us and how much you've been thinking about these things and how much you've written and your passion. You know, you said that you're 84 and it doesn't seem like you have any signs of slowing down. So I hope that you continue to make the world a better place.
Thank you very much.